PriceCheck, the pricing podcast, powered by Quicklizard.
Hi, I'm Iain Lewis, VP of Growth and Sales here at Quicklizard. On today's podcast, I'm joined by Joe. Joe, do you want to give a quick introduction?
Yep, I'm Joe Fleming, and I work at Venatech. We're a pricing and commercial excellence headhunter.
Great. Thanks for making the time to join on this conversation today. I thought maybe we'd kick it off with some of the changes that we're seeing both in companies and recruitment, how things are different now in 2026 compared to, say, 10 years ago. Thinking about things such as how the role of pricing has become either more broad or more specialized. Thinking about how there's much more data available now and that this data is being used for decision making, how that brings in challenges and so on and so forth. So, Joe, first of all, thinking about from a hiring perspective, are you seeing any changes nowadays compared to, say, 10 years ago, focused around the breadth of the role, the data, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, good to be here, Ian. Nice to spend some time to talk about it. And absolutely, I think so. I think obviously the challenges have always been there, but the way that companies are approaching it now are very different. And the kind of priority they're giving to pricing that wasn't given before, and the realization really of the value that it can bring. But with that said, there's still lots of companies that don't get it right, and lots of issues in there. Companies that do it well, companies don't do it well. But I think the role generally has a lot more prominence than it did, kind of 10 years ago.
One thing I'm starting to see, the companies I'm talking to, they're starting to separate out the role of pricing as something becoming more dedicated rather than something as part of somebody else's day job. So if we think about retailers, often pricing sits amongst category managers, amongst buyers, and so on and so forth. And you mentioned there in the introduction about the increased value of pricing. Are you seeing more of an increase in the need for specialist roles dedicated to pricing, or is it still quite a part of someone else's job?
Yeah, I think with this kind of function, it's still so individual to each different company, and kind of how they manage it and how they set these things up. That there are definitely more of these specific roles and positions around than there were kind of 10 years ago. But how companies are setting them up, I think can some of them still be a little bit confused. And a lot of times people talk about where does a role report to, what does it sit under? And I think there's still, in a lot of cases, a bigger question around the culture of pricing within a business, maybe more so than how it gets set up and who's actually doing the job.
One of the big changes I think that's happened, certainly over the last 10 years, has been really focused on the data, the amount of data that's available, the focus on it, the speed of change around data, the different sources of data. And because companies are relying so much on data for making decisions, both quicker decisions, more transparent decisions, and so on and so forth, have you seen any shift in the skill sets that people need to move into dedicated pricing or dedicated commercial roles?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the data question, you're definitely right there. And it kind of opens up an interesting question as to who is a good person to do a good job in that kind of a role. And the challenge we often see is companies who are getting started with it, they want somebody that can do everything. And so somebody who's got a really strong data skill set. So there you're maybe looking at kind of a pricing analyst, or they don't necessarily need to come from pricing, but with that sort of background. But then they're also expecting that same person to be making longer term strategic decisions, and being able to do other parts of the job around the change management piece. And then so finding that individual then, where you may have a really senior person carrying out a job that somebody less experienced could do, on a higher pay rate. And the same the other way around. It's difficult to find a senior person that's going to get stuck in and do the rolling the sleeves up and doing the data bit. I mean, and that kind of doesn't even get started on the question with what's going on with AI at the moment. But I think there are a lot of companies that need to be doing the basics before they're getting started with that bit anyway.
I know certainly from some recent conversations I've had with companies, they're thinking about, do they make or do they buy? And that introduces a whole skill set question around, where do you have the expertise? Where do you bring the knowledge in? How do you stay current, and so on and so forth? So it's interesting thinking around how companies could potentially use AI to drive things. And it's interesting that you mentioned there the need to drive change and decision process in the organization. I often see a need for companies to have a pricing person who's very influential around different aspects of the role. So they almost need to be experts around how production happens, how procurement happens, how marketing's happening, how sales is happening. There's a very much a cross-functional theme around the skill set needed of the jobs. Again, thinking about, where you're seeing things now compared to maybe 10 years ago, has that changed? Is there more of a particular area or less of a specific area that is coming through?
Yeah, I think the the big difference between maybe companies that kind of get it right and don't get it right is the positioning of the person or the function within the business. And then so maybe coming a little bit back to, you're talking about the different departments, but it's like, what's the culture across the organization? And I think there are examples of some businesses we've seen in the past where they don't have a pricing function, and you think, how are they going to do a good job of managing any of this? But because it's so disciplined through the business, and everybody knows where it fits and where it stands, it can still work well. You kind of got the other end of the scale where you maybe have set up a pricing center of commercial excellence, maybe a full kind of RGM function that sits in there doing that. And it's all well and good having that, but it then needs the kind of the right level of resource given to it, and the right level of kind of power and authority, and for it not to be seen as a project. Because quite often you kind of see a company will bite the bullet, bring somebody in to get something started. Maybe they're quite a senior person. They don't get given the control they need, the time or the resource, and that means they can't get it. They can't get what they've said they can do done. And then also you maybe then see some slow changes made. They then think they don't need that senior level person. So the project's kind of finished. They switch that person out, and it kind of gets forgotten. The next thing you know, the investment that they've made isn't paying off as they thought it would do, because the whole business situation and the environment's changed again.
That's quite interesting. And I'm thinking there, particularly what you said about coming in and being quite ambitious initially, but maybe a lack of ownership or a lack of ability to drive change in the organization. From my experience, some of this comes, I think, because pricing is such a cross-functional ownership today. So many departments and teams have a vested interest in pricing, from sales, who've got to go out and explain a price to a customer and win business, from procurement, who are thinking around how pricing and volume changes affect what they're doing, from finance, how a change in price can have a big knock-on through profitability, through revenue, and so on and so forth. Thinking about those sort of situations, how prepared do you feel companies are to really think through just how important pricing is in an organization? How can I do better with pricing? By better, I mean make more clear decisions around pricing, more easily explainable decisions around pricing, those sort of things.
Yeah, I think again, it's company to company. If you're going to generalize, you probably say not brilliantly. And often there's somebody kind of at the very, very top who will get this topic, and they'll drive it through. And then you'll see changes made and things happening. But then if there's a shift around there, a change there, that can change what the company is trying to achieve, how they think they're going to do it. And that's then when things kind of go backwards a little bit. And from what we've seen, there's no one straightforward way to do any of these things, but there's probably a couple of those common things within all businesses that are performing well that do them in a good way, although they're set up differently.
I know when I think about pricing and how tools are used to support pricing decision, thinking about how companies are going and executing that decision, often Excel is the default pricing tool. Excel is a great tool. but let's be honest, it doesn't scale in today's world. As we talked about earlier, the amount of data we have, the frequency of change of data, the use of data in that decision making, it lends itself more towards people in the pricing team who have that ability to do more than just analyze a spreadsheet, more than just build out some very interesting charts and data in Excel. But it's also leading towards where you touched upon earlier, AI and the use of AI in business. Obviously, there's a lot of companies that got to get the basics right, as you said, Joe, absolutely. But thinking a little bit more in the future, as AI tools become much more common in everyday use, and how we can potentially build tools and use tools for help with decision making to automate some of what we're doing. What are your thoughts around changing of skill sets, around focus more on data management, data interrogation, rather than data manipulation? As certainly from my background, when I was back in the day in pricing, it was very much, how can you extract data from systems of record? How can you put it into a usable, manageable way? How can you make something of it? It's all about the management of the data rather than the decision process that supports it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot in there in what you've just said, and it's kind of challenges for everybody. Meaning, because we do a lot of work, not just in retail, but in broader pricing. And I think where some of those other challenges have shown up, maybe if you take kind of the one that's been happening a lot recently is for SaaS businesses, where all of a sudden there's been a big revaluation there where they're all using seat-based pricing and looking at a consumption-based model. So you've then got investors, CEOs banging on the door of the CPO or whoever's in charge of it saying, why aren't we doing this? And suddenly there's resource, time and everything available to do that. The problem is they haven't got the basics figured out. The simple architectures in there, just even to do, make renewals, working more properly. So I think there's probably a lot of companies that are very, very interested in harnessing some of the AI stuff, but they're not ready to do that yet. And it's all kind of it's expense and it's cost. And I think another good example of that, and I don't know if it's just kind of coincidence, but in the last couple of months, so we've had a couple of people contact us that are new pricing hires, so pricing leads in businesses, B2B, and they've been asked to figure stuff out. A particular example is even just bringing together a centralized price list management tool, so everything's in one place. They've got several ERP systems. They've got a sales team that puts sales prices into a CRM that just kind of get then dragged out by various people. And they're looking at how do they solve that problem. And if you're looking at a pricing software tool to do that, is that a pricing software tool problem? Is that an ERP problem? And you're into the data. And then before the data's right, it's a big challenge to move on to the next bit.
Absolutely. And again, this talks back to the complexity of pricing with multiple different owners of it, different data sources with more data available. And also something you touched upon earlier, the value of pricing to an organization. It's great that companies are starting to think about, how can I monetize differently with changing world, changing data and so on. How can I monetize differently? But if they don't have the basics behind it, if they don't have the tools needed to support some of those changes and also the business price change. Let me go back. If they don't have the tools behind it to help the business process change behind that as well. I'm curious to think about how the future is going to look. Are we going to see an acceleration suddenly of capabilities within business where pricing and data become more entwined? Are we going to see a slow, gradual change from maybe how businesses were run 10 years ago to where they are now? Just curious, broad conversation. What are your thoughts? What do you think is going to happen next in business generally?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how good a job I could do of forecasting that or making any predictions on it. Yeah, it's impossible to say, isn't it? I think how these things get run and seem to start and go well is companies start small. They prove something that works. They can show that back internally, and then they can do the next bit. And it's kind of iterative. And I think companies that try and do it all at once seem to fall over a bit more quickly. Stuff doesn't get done. And I think budgets for these sorts of things are still tight within this particular niche. There are other areas where I think money gets thrown at it very, very easily. They can make a lot more progress a lot more quickly. But I think, yeah, we've seen with pricing projects how, as soon as they get over a certain kind of cost to a business, there are lots of different people involved in that process. Then, that I think often you don't even know who's got some eyes on that and who's making those decisions. And things can stall. But yeah, I think where things are very, very complicated. We've seen even in the last few weeks. There must be kind of 4 or 5 people that have popped up, within my network that are building things themselves, and whether they've got kind of the credibility and the depth to solve the problems at kind of the scale of a big retailer is harder to know. But all of them are receiving some interest. And I think it's because they're a little bit at a lower price point. There's the promise of the quicker implementation times, and it's them doing the implementation, not kind of outsourced elsewhere. But you get the feeling that everybody recognizes there's a massive return to be had. Still, companies figuring out, what's the best way, cost-effective way to do it.
That's really interesting. And it kind of leads me on to the next piece that I want to talk to you about. When I think about where a lot of companies have invested time and money today in tools in their business, we've seen a lot of investment in the execution of a price change. So upgrades of ERP systems, maybe upgrade of e-commerce systems, these sort of things. A lot of investment's gone there to make things more efficient, make prices go live more quickly, so on and so forth. One area we've not seen so much investment is around that whole decision process and tools to support the decision. So, for example, what the price should be, when to change price, what the impact of that price change is. Leading on from this leads me to think about how maybe some pricing tools are set up, and are they supporting the decision process, or are they following more of a software model? So we've been talking quite often about the idea of pricing moments. Pricing moments are times in organizations where someone is making a decision to change something in their business. So, for example, it could be a vendor or suppliers increased cost. Therefore, I now need to go and do something with that based around price. That's a moment. It could be where a competitor has changed the price or an offering. Therefore, pricing now needs to be reevaluated, reassessed. That's a pricing moment. Those pricing moments are all those times when a decision is being made around price, a decision made around the commercial terms. When we think about that and the focus of how operating teams work, they're working in those moments. Day in, day out, they're having to deal with these particular challenges at a specific point in time. A lot of software I've seen in the market is often built more around modules and capabilities. You mentioned earlier, they'll have a particular list price that they need to go and change, or there might be a module for CPQ, a module for contract price, and so on and so forth. Thinking about the difference between where teams operate today in those pricing moments and where software has historically been built and focused. Some of this is the legacy of how it's been built. Have you come across any issues in, say, the last 6 months, where there's maybe a disconnect between where a company is going in terms of the change they're looking for or change of the pricing team, and a disconnect then to how they're going to go and execute that?
Yeah, I don't know if we're in the detail of that enough to give, a too good answer. I know some issues we've seen when people are looking to select a vendor to help them do this sort of thing is, comment we'll often hear with maybe a larger vendor is stuff can come kind of too bundled, and they can't, and I think the term was used was they can't slice and dice the data how they would like to. And I think trying to get into that then leads into a lot of bespoke building and time and that sort of thing. So it's a bit like, here's an off-the-shelf thing. It does this, and it does a lot. Maybe some of the stuff that they don't necessarily need or are asking for. And sometimes I think it seems simpler is better. And also having a really good idea of why it's giving you the information that it's giving you. So getting away from that kind of the black box thing of knowing how these prices or decisions are being determined. And I think that's why people sometimes get dragged back to doing what they're doing before using Excel because it's so simple. I think as soon as it gets too complicated, people don't want to use it. And yeah, I think still it's the biggest driver is, people have the best systems in the world, but if nobody's using it, then yeah, it's kind of a waste.
Absolutely. And yeah, I've seen a few cases in the past where companies invested a lot of time and effort bringing in a new pricing tool. And you go back there about 6 months later, and you find it's being used as a download tool into Excel for people to still carry on doing what they've always been doing in Excel, but with a new data source, and the pricing tool being that new data source.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you see that there's that challenge for not being able to unbundle the capabilities, not being able to deliver the specific needs and requirements that a customer has. This is something we often talk about when we're engaging with customers. What is it they actually need? What do they need to go and solve for? And from my perspective, this is where it ties back to those pricing moments. What are those particular moments where you have friction or challenges in your business today? So that we can go focus on those. We can focus on how do you solve for those, not here's my offering, take everything, and now kind of maybe hope for the best.
Yeah. I think you got to have, if you're going to implement a system, if it's working well on day one, yeah, it sounds like, things aren't necessarily going to be working exactly the same in a year, 2 years, or 3 years. So yeah, I often ask people, can you give me a couple of examples of really successful implementations on this? And something's been running for a long time. There's not that many of them that you feel like they should be doing a little bit better. And then people start talking about changing it, looking at something else, doing it in a different way. So I think if you don't have some people looking at that and making sure it's still delivering what you need, it can quickly not be used the right way. Then you're overpaying for something that isn't doing the job that it was doing when you first got it.
Yeah, I've seen a few cases of that myself as well through the years. Joe, I want to start wrapping up the conversation a little bit now. Maybe conscious of your time, it's invaluable and it's important. From my perspective, what I'm starting to see as a trend in the market, and tell me if you disagree with this, if you agree with it, if you have a different perspective, the data complexity piece is maybe being underestimated a bit. People are managing data in Excel and other tools, but it's not necessarily really being levered to make consistent decisions with, and also transparent, repeatable decisions with those. That's one challenge I'm seeing. Another often is that companies have a process and they want a tool to fit the process. And so when they're implementing a new tool or they're looking to change the pricing team or changing the skill sets, it's focused around what we do today and anchored in what we do today, rather than anchored on what do we need tomorrow? Where is the business going in the future? Those are my two thoughts around what's happening, and kind of summing up some of the conversations today. What do you think? Do you strongly disagree? Do you have a different perspective? What are your thoughts just as we wrap up here?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything too controversial or, in that. I think, people often ask, nowadays, are the skills not available to do these kinds of jobs? Whether it's harder to find these people now or was a couple of years ago, not sure. It's more about the commitment of the company to pay for the person they need to do the job, and then empowering them to do it, and seeing it through, and keeping it going. I think the difficulties you've described, pretty common across lots of different functions within a business. But I think there's definite recognition that the opportunity here is very much untapped for companies. And if you get it right, do it properly, that's why people keep spending money on it and keep hiring for it, because it's worthwhile.
I agree. Pricing is incredibly valued to organizations. Joe, let's wrap up there. Appreciate your time. Appreciate you sharing your thoughts and perspectives on what's happening in the marketplace from your view, from where you see things happening. Great to catch up. And let's keep in touch and catch up again soon.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ian.
Thanks, Joe.